Good morning, everybody.
Thank you, Jay.
I should say Vasily Bozichnikai Praznika, which means Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. That's all I know in Slovenian. So I have to go. I was there in June last time, and it's like that's the wrong time of year for me to be there because I can say thank you and stuff like that. I want to talk about today about some of the growing pains, and please feel free. They said this is a little more freewheeling than the lecture yesterday, so if you have any questions about yesterday's talk, we can continue that discussion, and then. But I want to talk about a little bit about the growing pains that we experienced, and they had to do with there was a number of things that were. Growing pains, and that one of them was the whole idea of parishes, whether we should have parishes or not. And this was very much against what the master wanted. The master wanted very large priories and colleges, and involvement in colleges. Now the problem for us, though, was that our colleges were out in the middle of nowhere. And he of course, is thinking Paris, Saint-Jacques. He's thinking Toulouse. He's thinking Bologna. Naples, okay, Rome. These are large population centers. We're in St. Rose, Kentucky. Okay, we're in Somerset, Ohio. There were more people in Somerset then than there are now. But the fact is, it was not going to grow, and it was not going to be a major hub. So where were you going to get your students from? And that was immediately a big problem, is we're going to have a college, but nobody's going to come to it. And so they turned into studia for us. They turned into either novitiates or a studentate. And we went back and forth between St. Rose and Somerset, Ohio. And then the master would say, I want all our students to be in St. Rose. So they would all go from Somerset to St. Rose. And he had no idea of the distances involved in the United States. He was thinking things were not that far away, and it was like he has no clue as to how far away these cities are in the Midwest especially. And so that was a huge conflict. And when the Irish began coming in the 1840s, the Irish right away are not interested in colleges. They're not interested in, they're interested in setting up parishes with grammar schools. And this is going to be the immigrant kind of right across the board. Even when the Slavs are coming, the Italians are coming, the idea was you build a school first, you build the rectory, and then you build the church. And this was going to be the kind of the paradigm for the Irish Dominicans who are coming now, or the Irish who are coming and are now joining this province of St. Joseph, which goes all the way from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains. So it is a gigantic enterprise that is underway, and it's really. Oh, thanks. Okay, that's okay. So, but I just want you to. They were constantly looking for parishes, and even St. Louis, the provincial rights. This is Joseph Augustine Kelly, whose diary we have. He has 4 volumes of a diary, which really nobody knows about except me. I mean, it's one of those great resources that everybody who has written on yellow fever in Memphis has never looked at this diary. And this guy was the pastor of our parish in Memphis during the yellow fever epidemic. So it's a goldmine of information for lots of reasons, because he starts the diary in 1850 and he dies in 1885. So he is pretty faithful. He gets ordained in 1850, and he's faithful to that diary for the most part throughout. And it really, he goes to a general chapter. I'll tell you about that, but his opinion of Jandel is very interesting. But in 1881, he goes up to St. Louis, and he said, I met Father Fortune there, who was one of our men, stayed with Father Tolgan, and preached for him. Called on Archbishop Kendrick, he always spells it with a D, Kendrick, and again asked for a place to build a church. He was non-committal, but did not refuse. That's why he became a bishop, I suppose. He was when I was at the Smithsonian, I was telling some of the guys this a few years ago, and we did the first time the Vatican Embassy ever did anything with the Smithsonian. So it was like an art thing and what the Vatican was like and how St. Peter's got built. And so on Friday night, we had an open house at the Vatican Embassy in Washington. Well, this was immensely popular. I said there were between 130 and 150 people that signed up for this. And part of it was to go to the reception. They wanted to get in there and see what the Vatican Embassy looked like. Well, the next day, the keynote speaker was going to be the ambassador. And I said, what are you going to talk about? Oh, he says, I will only talk for 2 minutes. I thought, yeah, right. That's the first time an ambassador will ever talk for only 2 minutes. So I said, could you please say something about what it's like to be an ambassador and why we have an embassy and the Vatican has an embassy and what do we do? No, he doesn't say anything about that. He starts talking about art and the Vatican's interest in art. And he said, and the reason, he said, people want us to sell all the art we have and give it to the poor. He said, no, he says, you know why we don't do that? Because some Japanese industrialist will buy it all up and the poor people will never see it again. This way, the poor people can always come and see their artwork. It's there for nothing to see. So anyway, I thought that was a good reason, but he kept going on for 45 minutes and people kept, and then finally the program director said, get him out of here. Okay, so somebody asked him a couple questions at the end, and then he left. And so then I got to the podium, and she said, he didn't answer a single question I asked him. And I said, why do you think he's the Vatican ambassador to the United States? I said, that's a real skill, to be able to talk after you ask the question and not answer your question at all. It's brilliant. Anyway. And then I tried to answer her question as best I could. But this is what bishops are going to do. And then he goes up to Chicago, and I think the same thing happens in Chicago. I'm going to see if I have actually a quote. But he goes up to Chicago and the same thing. He says, I think we will have, he says, I saw Archbishop Fian and asked for a church in Chicago and a house in his Episcopal city. Think he will grant it. This is 1881. Went on to New York and stayed over for a week. I don't think we got a house in Chicago until, does anybody know? One thing you might do on your website, this is a recommendation. I looked up your house in St. Louis, and all it talks about is this building, or the building of your priory, and the history of that building. But it doesn't talk about when you came to Chicago, or when you came to St. Louis, or why you came to St. Louis, and what you're doing in St. Louis. And I thought that would really be helpful. That would be interesting, to.
I think, John, we came to Chicago in 1921 or 1922.
Okay.
We built the House of Philosophy.
Okay.
In the province of St. Joseph.
And then the high school was built.
1920. It was opened 1929.
Okay. And then they split in 1939, and the rest is history. Yeah, that's an interesting story in itself, is the split, how that happened, and all the shenanigans that went on, the wheeling and dealing about who's going to pay for the high school because it wasn't finished yet. The personnel, are they going to move back to the province, to the province of St. Joseph, or are they going to have to stay? And the principal is saying, we just got accredited. We can't lose our faculty, okay? So we have to keep these guys here. And so there was a lot of horse trading that went on between, some guys wanted to go back east, some guys in the east wanted to go to the Midwest. I mean, it was really something. I'm kind of glad I wasn't around for that. But anyway, but the obtaining parishes was something that they wanted to do. They got a parish in London, Ontario, and that was another fiasco because the bishop in London, Ontario decided he was going to move to Windsor. He wanted to be in a place that was more French at the time, even though Windsor doesn't sound like a very French city. It was going to be more French than London, Ontario. Okay, so the vicar of the diocese had gone to St. Rose and knew us, and he offered the cathedral in New London to us. He said there's $3,000 or $4,000 in debt. And if you would be willing to assume that debt, you can have that parish for 99 years. So Kelly is the provincial at the time. Kelly jumps at it and writes to the master and says, you'll be very glad to know that, like they always did, that we have taken a parish in London, Ontario, and it has very good prospects. It's a beautiful building. It's only $3,000 in debt. We can pay that off very quickly, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the master is furious. And then, shortly after, the bishop dies, and a new bishop comes in and moves back to New London, or to London, Ontario, and throws us out. And we said, well, what about that? We paid off the debt. What about the 99 years? Forget about it. Get out of here. And so he said, I'll give you any parish you want in the diocese. And we said, no, we're out of here. And so we left. That was our very brief excursion into another country to get into kind of English-speaking Canada. It didn't work. So we've been always wary about parishes and our dealings with bishops, too. That was another thing that was always... The bishop of New York invited us to come. This is Hughes, John Hughes. And he said, but I'm going to own the property. I'm going to own everything. And we were like, he's just using us to staff something until he gets tired of us and we're out. And so what we insisted on is that if we're going to come to New York, we're going to own the property and the buildings. And so the next bishop said, okay, that's a deal. He was kind of getting desperate for people to take over some of these parishes. Manhattan was growing. Actually, the first golf course in the United States was in Manhattan, believe it or not. That's how much farmland was there, but it was growing very quickly. And so he was desperate for... Go ahead.
Father, the phenomenon of men's religious orders staffing parishes is obviously extremely common in the U.S., not just Dominicans, but all over the place, right? Is every order kind of doing the same thing, where it's not really common in Europe, but then there's sort of this new American paradigm that they have to adjust to?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I think everybody's got parishes. And it's kind of a combination of the new situation, and it's also the immigrants coming in, needing parishes, wanting parishes. So the Irish are coming, they want their own parish. It's kind of interesting to me. Say in Memphis, you have 4 Catholic parishes right downtown. There are 2 of them are Irish, 1 is German, 1's Italian. And they're all within walking distance. When I grew up in Cleveland, I could walk. Our parish was German and the kind of the Slovenian overflow from the neighboring Slovenian neighborhood, and the Germans were moving out. But I could walk to the Irish parish down, it was about maybe 20 blocks down, and there was another Irish parish that way. We were surrounded by Irish. And then there was a small Lithuanian parish that we could also walk to. And there was a Polish parish that we could walk to, even though I didn't like walking into those neighborhoods because I thought they're going to know that I'm not Polish and I'm going to be in trouble. This is dangerous, They're going to know I'm not Lithuanian. So you kind of stayed in your own safety of your own neighborhoods. Kind of interesting. But they brought their priests with them. So the Polish are coming with, whatever order that might be. So that was an important thing for us to do, and we were always battling with the master because he turned us down for a couple of places. We wanted a place in Baltimore. He said no. We were able to really work around him in interesting ways, I would say, when it came to parishes. And finally, he got exasperated with us, and he sent over an Irishman to be his visitor. He wasn't going to come himself. And the visitor was really quite negative about our parishes. He said this is an abomination that, and the quote is really, it's very strong about, they shouldn't be doing this, and this is an abomination, even though, I'm just trying to think if I can see what his exact quote was, but it was very strongly worded, even though he actually helped in our parishes by preaching in a variety of places. He stayed for 2 years, and he was really a great success, and everything he made in terms of money, he gave to the parish that he was preaching at. So he wasn't sending it back to Ireland or off to Rome. It was like, I'm going to preach in Louisville, and he preaches about how the Lord does not have a place to lay his head. And so that was his plea to the people of Louisville, that we have to build this church. And the money poured in, and they built that church. They built Washington, New Haven, places all over that were not connected with universities at all, even though the house in New Haven is kind of on the grounds of Yale. It's not really, we've never been affiliated officially with the university there. So the desire to have parishes was very strong, and I think we finally won out on that. And then we started to send money to, again, like I said yesterday, you can't talk about our province without talking about money. They started to send money to Rome to support various things that the master, and that had the benefit of shutting up the master in terms of what we were doing. It's like, well, if they're sending me money, I guess it can't be too bad, you know, what they're doing in the States. So let them do it, let them continue. And we managed to kind of keep the Angelicum going by sending mass stipends and things like that to the master, and all during the Depression too. So he was always kind of amenable to what our provincial wanted to do. And parishes were one of the things that we wanted to do. Another thing that, and this is this map here, let's see if I can move this forward. This is going to be one of our first parishes in Memphis. The bishop of the Diocese of Nashville was a Dominican. Again, a lot of these frontier towns are going to have religious order priests becoming their bishops. And this is actually still true today. If you go to mission countries like the Solomon Islands, you're going to find religious order priests are going to be bishops. We had a bishop in Pakistan. We had a bishop in Peru. We have a bishop right now in the Solomon Islands. Pardon me? Nigeria. Okay, who is that? Okay, yeah. And so that's a fairly common, so if you want to be a bishop, you really should become a missionary if you're in a religious order. Your chances are best, let's put it that way, if that's what you have in mind. So that was also true in the United States. So a lot of these places, St. Paul, Minnesota is going to have a Dominican bishop. Nashville will have a Dominican bishop. The Jesuit bishop in Baltimore, Carroll. So this is going to be a very common thing. And it will lead to problems for us as well, because they're going to be taking our best people away. So that's going to be one of our growing pains, is going to be, but anyway, what happens in Memphis is he has two diocesan priests in succession. He sends one guy just one person to Memphis first. The church, this is the downtown area. Even today, this is where kind of the center of things is. And our church is around here somewhere, very close to where the action is. You could walk everywhere in that old city. It was 50,000 people by the time you got to about 1870, whereas St. Louis was about, was it as many as 300,000 by then? It was certainly more than 100,000. So these cities like Louisville, Cincinnati were much bigger than Memphis. But the bishop is Pius Miles. He is the first bishop of Nashville. He asks his diocesan priest, they leave the parish and go to New York because they said, we're not staying here. This place is broke. We can't make a go of it. There's no building, et cetera, et cetera. So 2 in a row left, and he wrote to the provincial of our province and said, can you send anybody? And he sends a few guys to the parish in 1846. So that's when we really took over the church in Memphis, and we've been there to this day. But that gave him a certain stability, at least in Memphis. Okay, we have that kind of settled, and now we can move on. But that was, again, a place that we kind of readily took that, because it was a parish. Again, it's not affiliated with any university at all. We had an orphanage there. Those were very big deals. Everywhere that Father Kelly went, he started an orphanage in the South, if it was in Memphis or if it was in Nashville. And they have an interesting history of their own. So the other thing that happens for us in terms of growing pains is losing our leadership. Anytime anybody emerged as a capable leader, they were usually made a bishop. So, and that was true of Pius Miles. So anytime it looked like he could become the provincial and lead us into the, no, he's gone. And then we had Alemanni becomes, he was the provincial for 2 years, and then they appoint him to be, in 1848, he's elected by us to be provincial. Well, the gold rush is taking place in 1849, and they make him the Bishop of Monterey, California, and say, why don't you go out there, take another Dominican with you, and a guy named Villarasa. So both of them are gone from our province. He's made a bishop. There's a bishop, Grace is made the second bishop of St. Paul, Minnesota. Fenwick is made the bishop of Cincinnati. So all our leaders are constantly being removed from us. And one recent provincial in our province said it would be an interesting history to write about how we had trouble getting going simply because so many of our leaders were always being removed. Yep.
Was it too off topic to ask you something about the orphanages?
Sure.
So did brothers directly care for children, and when did the orphanages end?
First, they would bring in religious sisters. So Dominican sisters, say in Memphis, the sisters are coming from St. Catherine's in Kentucky and from Nashville. Okay, so Nashville is founded in 1860 as a congregation of religious women. They're all kind of interconnected up until about 1862 or something like that, when the master says that the provincial is not the superior of the sisters. So the provincial is actually the one who moved them around. And if there was a disputed election in a convent of sisters, the provincial would then appoint somebody to be the superior. So the provincial, the male provincial of the province of St. Joseph had a lot of control over, and he would visit the sisters' convents too. That was one of his jobs, not just to visit the men's priories, but to visit the women's congregations as well. And Kelly's diary is kind of funny on that. He says, I don't know what they're going to make of me. He has some really great comments. He'll go to the Louisville. He says he just came back from Europe, and he went to stay at our house in Louisville, and he says, somebody preached. He said he was a very strange priest, gave a sermon this morning. But there's no name attached. I don't know if it was a Dominican or what, but he'll say things like that, a very strange person. So what happens is the sisters will then be brought in to take care of the orphans. And that's pretty much how it works. And the priest would be there to say Mass for them. They supported them. The one in Memphis is particularly interesting because of the yellow fever epidemics. So the reason you have so many orphans is partly because of disease. The Civil War will take a great toll on parents, and yellow fever is going to be another big factor here. So this, and the orphanage is pretty much in the inner city, and what he wants to do, Kelly wants to move it out to the country, because there's the idea that the country is safer than the city is. There seems to be more death happening in the city because of the concentration of population, and so we're going to move out to the country, and that was true. They didn't know why, but they knew, and he actually moved out after 1878. He moves out the orphans, and there's about 70 of them, and one of them died from yellow fever, which was miraculous, that was the only yellow fever death because out of a population of 50,000, 10,000 would die in Memphis. Okay, so it was 20%, and he was able to beat those odds. But the other thing he does in 1878 is he moves the orphans to Nashville. The Bishop of Nashville writes to him and says, I have room for the orphans if you can get them here. Memphis was quarantined, which meant you couldn't leave, okay, after a certain date. I mean, everybody fled that could in the first days because they knew if they stayed too long, they'd be stuck. And you were not going to be able to get on a train and get out of town. So he actually will manage to move those 50 orphans to Nashville somehow. And he doesn't tell in the diary how he did it. And I said, one reason might be he might want to do it again. And he doesn't want anybody to know. There were Irish policemen. He's Irish, okay? He was 10 when he came to this country. So he would say, now you boys will be looking the other way, won't you? And as we get our 50, I mean, you can't move 50 kids that easily, you know, and five sisters to go from Memphis to drive. Right now, it's a 3-hour drive. So he probably got them to a train outside the city and took them that way. They had a place for them in Nashville. And then when the fever was over in 1878, when the winter came, basically, everything was safe again. People began to return. He then returns the orphans to Memphis and then builds this country house, which was kind of his pride and joy, is that he could now have that. He felt that they would be safe out there, and they were. So that's an interesting. The one in Nashville is very interesting, the orphanage, because he becomes the vicar in 1862, I think, of the Diocese of Nashville. So he's the vicar general, he's the acting bishop, basically, and he finds a property that is a little bit south of Nashville. The trouble is, in 1864, there is a Confederate army coming up to attack Nashville. Sherman has gone south, Sherman has taken over Atlanta, and Sherman decides, the hell with my supply lines, I'm going to keep going to Savannah, okay? So the people in Nashville, the army there is going to have to defend Nashville, and the Confederate Army thinks this is a big opportunity. The trouble is the orphanage is right between the two armies. They evacuate the orphans to the cathedral in Nashville and put them in the basement of the cathedral, which was serving as a military hospital, the main floor. They put the orphans down below. The orphanage is destroyed in the battle that takes place. And then the Union general says to Kelly, we feel really bad about this, but my headquarters is right down the road from where that your orphanage was, and you're welcome to use my headquarters until we can rebuild your orphanage. The federal government actually rebuilt that orphanage, which was very unusual in the South for the federal government to rebuild anything. But they felt kind of so guilty about the fact that this orphanage had been destroyed that the federal government actually paid for it after the war. Yeah.
How did the friars navigate the divisions of the Civil War? I mean, were there splits, or were they serving as chaplains on either side?
Yes. Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. This is like a plant almost. That we have 2 chapters of a book written by a Union officer who was a Dominican priest, who was present at the battle. He started after Gettysburg. They were going to execute 3 soldiers for desertion. And it turns out that they were Catholics. One was Italian, and so they said they went to Washington. So the army is outside of Washington in the area of Manassas, about to head south. They come to Washington. Can we send a priest out there? So this Irishman goes out. Egan is his last name. He ends up being pastor in Louisville. He goes out, anoints these guys. Here's their confessions. And the general out there says, can you stay? Can you, possibly stay with our unit? It's an Irish unit from Boston, and we haven't had a chaplain. So he asks for permission to join the army, and he gets it. The provincial says, you're good to go. So he joins, he gets commissioned in the army, and he's with them until they're mustered out after the Battle of Cold Harbor. They all head back to Massachusetts. He goes with them, and then the Corps commander says, I want you to stay if you can. He says, only if I get a commission from Abraham Lincoln. And he got it. So he stays until the end of the war. And he writes about Appomattox. He's there in the final, and it's very exciting because he's almost like in the staff of the general, General Sheridan. He's like in his, and Sheridan says, I want to know where this unit is. Can you? And off he takes off to fight. So he's like, you know, I mean, he's a chaplain, but he's actually acting as a part of the staff of the general in this final. But those two chapters are riveting. But we also had several kind of unofficial chaplains in the Confederate Army. One of them came from a guy named Jarbo. He was from Memphis. And so when the Confederate Army is near Shiloh, and they have that big battle, he goes out from Memphis and is with the Army. There's a story about him being arrested on the battlefield because he's anointing Confederate soldiers and is giving them water after the Union has finally won this battle. And he's arrested, and you know they're thinking he's a spy and all this, and it's confusing about what happens next. Our historians say that General Sheridan, who was one of his altar boys in Somerset, recognized him, and that's why he was let free. The fact is, Sheridan wasn't at the Battle of Shiloh. He was in Chicago buying horses for the cavalry. So that story is out the window. Another story says a lawyer who was with the Union Army in Memphis knew him from Memphis, and that's how he gets out. His story is he escaped, and he went north and made his way to Somerset and eventually Zanesville and stayed there. So what exactly happened? Was he paroled? You know, and that's why he never rejoined the Confederate Army. That's a little bit unclear. There is an article supposed to be in the Freeman's Journal that was written by him about a year afterwards. I have not been able to find that article, so that's one of those things it's police work. You have to go back and go almost page by page because they don't have really good indexes for these things. So we did have chaplains in the Civil War, and there's some accounts of what they did and who they were with. And so the sympathies tended to be with the South. Even one story will show you this, is the house in Somerset, Ohio. The war has begun. Sheridan is from Somerset, Ohio. One of his houses is still there. He's back from West Point. He's riding with a classmate of his, and they ride past the priory of St. Joe's, and a Confederate flag is flying from the flagpole. Sheridan, is this taped? I'm going to say what Sheridan said. Maybe I'll clean it up a little bit. You'll get the point. So Sheridan takes the flag down, folds it up very neatly, and rings the bell. And the priest comes to the door, and he says, "Here's your flag, Father." He said, "If I ever see this flag flying from the flagpole again, I will burn this whole place down," okay? And he said, this is not a border state. Ohio is not a border state. But you could tell from that the sympathies, even with the guys who had come from Kentucky to Ohio, were a little bit with the South. Kelly's diary is very sympathetic toward the cause of the South. And even in some cases, he'll talk about slavery and that people in the North don't actually understand the institution. So he doesn't really defend it at length, but there are little hints here and there and that's why he was so popular when he was in Nashville. He had taken the place of the Dominican bishop, Wayland, who was very pro-union. Most of the Irish who were coming were very anti-slavery. And so Wayland is there in Nashville. The Union Army takes over. Rosecrans is the Union general. Rosecrans is very Catholic, and so they would have dinner together on a regular basis. This drove the clergy in Nashville crazy, and the people, they hated this guy. And he finally resigns. And they bring in Kelly, who is, at the time, he's the pastor in Memphis. They bring him in to be the vicar, and he is very popular because he fights for the rights of the Catholics, for one thing. The only building project that was allowed to go forward in Nashville during the war was the building of St. Cecilia's convent. Everything else was, all building materials were, you know, they all went to the Army except for that one project. But he'll talk a lot about how Rosecrans never touched any of the Catholic churches. He turned all of the Protestant churches into hospitals. But then Rosecrans left, and another guy comes in named Granger, and he starts talking about, I want to take over this Catholic church and that Catholic church, and Kelly is outraged about this, and it's like, no, you can't do this, you know. But so there were delicate negotiations that went on between the occupying army of the North and Kelly being the vicar of the. So, but anyway, yeah, there is definitely an involvement in the Civil War. Okay, so the last thing is elections. We really struggled in the beginning with electing our own people to be superiors because the requirements for priories were so stringent. You needed 12 men in a priory in order to have it be a priory. How many men did we have in the province? Not that many. Okay, there's a few here in a parish, a few here in a parish. We had 4 and 5 in places, but nowhere near the 12 that they required to have a priory. So you basically have 2 priories. You have St. Joe's in Ohio and St. Rose in Kentucky. So I'm just going to read you something about our the elections, which are, I read this, San Francisco was just electing a new provincial a few weeks ago, and I was there, and so the night before, I read them about what our election mess was like. One factor complicating the shortage of numbers was a prescription that a delegate to a provincial chapter could not vote for himself. Thus, if one of the vocals was a strong candidate, eligible votes were further reduced. This happened in 1847, when 4 vocals split their votes and a 5th was forbidden to vote for himself. When the master received this information in 1848, he appointed Joseph Alemany to be provincial, who was not present at the chapter. Another election followed quickly in 1850 because he had been made Bishop of Monterey, and Matthew O'Brien was elected. In 1854, James Whalen was elected. He would become the second bishop of Nashville. He was the problem. He was the Union sympathizer, James Whalen. He's elected in 1854, but the ever-vigilant Jandel declared the election null and void on the grounds that one of the vote counters, one of the scrutators as we call them, was the previous provincial, O'Brien. Jandel then went ahead and appointed Whalen anyway. Okay, he wanted control over what was like in terms of our provincial, so he liked the fact that we couldn't elect a provincial on our own, that he would be able to appoint. That's what he really wanted for a long time, to hang on to that. In 1858, Kelly is going to be he gets elected. He was only 31 years old at the time and would soon be the hero of these yellow fever epidemics. In 1862, and the other thing was crazy, was that our provincials had the habit of not being reelected. They didn't want to be reelected. So you served for 1 term and then you were done. Why they didn't continue for a 2nd term, I don't know, but that was the tradition. So in 1862, 6 vocals, this is how many we're dealing with at the chapter, they failed to agree on someone to succeed Kelly, and they asked the master to appoint. Kelly sent a letter of his own describing the election process as difficult, since the only eligible brethren at St. Rose were disqualified from attending because they had been definitors in the previous chapter. Jandel appoints Nicholas Raymond Young, who had ingratiated himself to Jandel while he was studying in Italy, avowing his love for strict observance and the master's attempts to reform the order. Young, unfortunately, had a history of resigning from offices. He had been prior St. Rose, he resigned. He was president of St. Joe's College, he resigned. As prior St. Dominic's in Washington, he resigned. Within 2 years of his appointment as provincial, scandal envelops Father Young, and he fled the province. He did not resign. His socius took over the running of the province and eventually negotiated Young's resignation on the condition that all the charges against Young be dropped.
What was the nature of the scandal?
Good question. Now, if you read O'Daniel, it's very interesting. O'Daniel's our first historian. He writes the first history of our province. O'Daniel will say, Young left the order to the universal sadness of the brethren. But if you read the letters to Rome from the brethren from previous provincials, it's like, thank God that SOB finally got caught, you know, and now he's gone and we don't have to worry about him again. Well, then years later, they negotiate his return to the province. And O'Daniel writes, to the universal rejoicing of the order, he has returned. And the letters from the previous provincials are, you never allow this maniac back into the province. There's a real disconnect between O'Daniel and what happened. We think what happened was there was kind of a sexual thing between him and a secretary in Zanesville, and that's what happened. There was a little bit of a liaison there and a scandal, and that's why he eventually fled. And then that was over with, and he wanted to come back, and they allowed him back in. But the exact nature of that is clouded. Let's put it that way. Now, as if matters were not confused enough, now we're talking about 1864. For nearly 2 months during the interim period, this guy named Father O'Brien, a previous provincial, decided to take over charge of the province, calling him the vice provincial. That this insertion lasted less than 2 months indicated that cooler heads probably prevailed. So again, here's a previous provincial saying what's happening with all of this, saying, now I'm in charge, okay? And everybody has to, so it's chaos. The elective chapter of 1864 also failed to elect, choosing 2 men from Europe who refused to accept their election. So Jandel, after consulting the Irish provincial, appointed William Dominic O'Carroll, a member of the Irish province, to be, and he becomes our provincial. And he is a Jandelian, and he is very strict. And he's the one who's going to set up Louisville as an observant house, strict observance, a large house, and he will start the preaching bands. That's the one thing he does that is actually helpful to the province. He had spent some time with the French Dominicans and was a convinced Jandelian, but the choice of O'Carroll turned out to be ultimately very divisive. For the next 20 years, the brethren of the province fell into 2 camps, either pro-O'Carroll, the minority, or anti-O'Carroll, which was the minority. His reforms were eventually modified or eradicated, but a legacy of bad feeling over strict observance persisted for a long time. Three of the next 4 provincials were anti-O'Carroll and anti any of his reform attempts. And they would try to undo everything. The 4th person, they said, was rather indifferent. So anyway, the next election, though, now I'm going to pass over one. Jandel will try to find flaws with our ballots. They had an election in 1869. It went to 39 ballots. Jandel tried mightily to find a flaw in the election in order to judge it invalid, but in the end, he approved the election. He immediately sent a visitator in the person of the famous Irish preacher Thomas Burke, who declared Dunn, Father Dunn, who had been elected, a good little man, but an imbecile. Okay, so there you go. The next election went to 87 ballots, and finally was decided in favor of the virulently anti-O'Carroll John Antoninus Rockford. But the next election in 1877, and that's where I'll end with the election messes, ranks as one of the rowdiest in the history of the province. 5 ex-provincials plus the vicar of the province, James Marr, voted on the eligibility of 6 delegates and were of a mind to keep the Rochford camp to a minimum. 2 pro-Rochford delegates, a guy named Edelin and Dominic Noon, were rejected, the former because choral office was not observed in his house in Zanesville, and the latter because he lived in the rectory at Holy Trinity in Somerset and not at the Priory of St. Joe's. 2 anti-Rochford delegates were admitted, even though one of them came from the same unobservant house in Zanesville where a rejected delegate had resided. This was the ex-provincial Wilson, who was admitted on the grounds that he had been a provincial, and that kind of superseded the strict observance rule of the house. Of 2 others who came from similarly unobservant houses, one was rejected because he failed to bring testimonial letters, while the other, Stephen Byrne, was admitted. It was Stephen Byrne who would ultimately be elected as a compromise candidate. His term was not happy. Almost immediately, charges were brought against him, the nature of which is not also clear from any document. Okay, and then there's even more that goes on in other elections, but I'll leave it at that you could see it took until, I would say, the late 1800s before calm kind of came on to our election process, and that the master was not as involved. Jandel will be out of the way, and so yeah, kind of more normal elections will take place. And then we get into the elections in the early 1900s. For the next 50 years, we will have 2 provincials. So it's kind of the opposite of what was happening in the 19th century. We then began to get the Irish machine politics, where they figured out how to keep getting reelected. And the way they did it was to appoint people to be preacher generals or STMs. And every preacher general and every STM was, by law, permitted to go to a provincial chapter and vote. So if the Marr is going to be appointing his buddies to be, and then they're going to approve more buddies, you have the buddy system, and they keep reelecting, you know, Marr until you get to 1930. And then the reform candidate, McDermott, comes on and he wins. Finally, they upseat. And then McDermott does exactly the same thing. He starts to get his buddies together, and he learns from Marr how to do this. He will be provincial till 1955. So he manages to stay in. And it's finally a master general from Ireland who says, I do not like postulations, which are basically allowing an extraordinary election like that to take place. And he said, I will not. And he has a letter read at that election, I think it was in 1955, saying before the election was actually held, so it was outside, he says, I'm not interfering with the election, but I'm telling you people in Washington where this is happening, I am not probably going to approve if you elect McDermott again. And the first ballot, I remember this hearing from Ferris Smith, he was a student, and he was a secretary at the chapter. And the first ballot went against McDermott. And he leaned over to Ferris Smith, to the student, and he said, they're voting against their consciences. And so then he called a halt to the election and had a little bit of a quorum with his buddies and said, I'm not going to be elected. And even if I am, I will not be approved. So let's elect so-and-so. And that's who they elected. So it was a McDermott kind of, not exactly a toady. He was really a good guy. And he actually, they said, was the first provincial that anybody had ever seen. Because McDermott was up in his penthouse in New York, and that was, you never saw him. If you had any business with him, you went up there and that was it. But he never really went around the province and So the next provincial was actually very visible to everybody. It was a relief that now we've kind of moved away from this kind of stranglehold on the election process. And then they eventually made the PGs and STMs not eligible to vote, which also helped to solve the problem. So I think I'm going to stop there, but those are all our growing pains. I don't know if this is much of a seminar, it's just another talk that I gave, but it's, with questions, thank you for the one about the orphans and also about the Civil War. Yeah.
John, you mentioned yesterday when you referred to Mazzucchelli.
Yes.
Growing up on the south side of Chicago, I thought the name was Monsignor Matthew Kelly.
Yes. Yeah.
Where everyone was either Irish, Polish, or Protestant. So the Italian name was rather new to me until a relatively short time ago. But could you say something about how he established the community of Dominican sisters in St. Catharines, Kentucky? And then isn't he also the founder of
Cincinnati, not St. Catharines. St. Catharines came with Wilson, who was one of the first 4 of our people to come from England. And he just got up in the pulpit and said, we need young women to help us in the foundation of a school. And 4 women came forward and they wanted to bring the nuns from England. That was the original plan. And for some reason, they could not come. I don't know if it was financial or it was their rule or they just didn't want to come. But that was the original plan. As Alan White said, Alan White was a provincial of the English province, and he read this thing I did. He said, I knew that you wanted to take our money. I knew that you wanted to take our men. But he said, I didn't know you wanted to take our women, too. He said, you wanted to take everything to the United States. I said, yes, we did. So that's how that started in St. Catharines. Now, Mazzucchelli's involved up there in Wisconsin, right? And he will attract some sisters from Columbus to come and assist. At some point, they come and add to the community, and then they start a college or an academy up there as well. And he's always very close to that community, supporting them. He kind of is the one who writes their rule almost, and it's a little bit controversial because he doesn't want them wearing white, and that's kind of a cause of concern for the provincial of the St. Joseph province. It's like, what's he doing? They're wearing black. And I think it was more of a practical thing in the wilderness to be wearing darker clothes than white is just going to get dirty very quickly kind of thing. I think that's what was, but he does seem to have almost written his own kind of constitutions for that congregation. But he keeps it going. And I mean, it's a very complicated thing because eventually they close the academy and they sell the property, and then he tries to buy it back, and the province is like, what are you doing? You know, where are you going to get the money to do this? And you're doing this now really outside of permission from anybody. And so he becomes, at the end, a little bit a poco fanatico, as you might say. And that's where you're going to get divided opinions about him. O'Daniel doesn't like him at all. Oh no, O'Daniel likes him a lot in the history. He's very favorable to Mazzucchelli. Says he does great work. Kelly actually says he's an oddball, but you have to hand it to him. He's done heroic work everywhere he's gone. And so Kelly actually visits him in Cincinnati. And he says that this guy, Mazzucchelli, has actually dug his own grave, and that somebody has come by and put a sign on top of it saying, Hic non jacet Samuel Mazzucchelli. Here, because the thing is still empty. Here does not lie Samuel Mazzucchelli. But anyway, but he does, he compliments him a lot. And he says he's better left alone because he's really done such great work. So that's an interesting. And then the Bishop Grace, also in St. Paul's, commends the work of Mazzucchelli. So it's, and then the next guy comes along, Coffey, who writes American Dominicans, and he hates Mazzucchelli. He says he wasn't a faithful member of the province, he wasn't a good Dominican, But what Coffey is doing is basically trying to undo the work of O'Daniel as a historian. So whatever O'Daniel said was good, Coffey's going to say, because Coffey hated O'Daniel, I mean, it was a personal thing. He had kept Coffey locked up in the archives all during World War II when Coffey wanted to be a chaplain, and McDermott said, yeah, you can keep him, you know, because O'Daniel was another vote for McDermott. So he wasn't going to want to get O'Daniel mad at him, so he let O'Daniel run ragged over this poor guy Coffey. So then when Coffey wrote his own history, he decided to take on a lot of the opinions that O'Daniel had and reverse them. But my feeling is Mazzucchelli really did amazing work. I mean, it was a very difficult, to be in the frontier was not easy. And for him to found all these parishes and to found that congregation was amazing. So I think we owe him a lot. Not too many people would go where he went, let's put it that way, including his cousins, I think, or his nephews. No cappuccino, I said, in Iowa. So his nephews came over and they returned immediately to Italy. Anybody else? Yeah.
This might be a weird question. So you've talked about the history of Dominican friars in the U.S. about 1800 and let's say the late date is like 1955. Was that McDermott's last?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. 60 years ago. And in the 19th century, I mean, you talk about the scandal in Somerset, and you talk about the
Elections.
elections and all this kind of stuff. I imagine if you were actually living there, that would actually be tumultuous and angst-ridden. But now, 150 years later, we can almost joke about it. What do you think the time period is from when people are living in something and it's the end of the world and it's contentious to the point where you can actually get a good bit of distance on it and actually look at it from outside? I don't know, 60 years seems to be something like that. Does that question make sense?
Yeah. I think they were tumultuous only at the time of the elections. I think for the 4 years in between these chapters, life went on, and the provincial made appointments, he visited places, he moved people around, and life went on kind of normally. But then you'd get the election, and then all of a sudden it was Irish politics at its, most interesting.
I asked the question because all of us go through exactly the same kinds of things all the time here.
Yeah.
We'll have 2 or 3 years of peace and quiet, and then, elections, or scandal, or, some tragedy.
Yeah.
But there is a certain amount of time after which you can kind of get some distance on it.
When I was in Edinburgh in Scotland, they had an election they're going to have a provincial chapter, and the young guy in our house was, he was actually a Marxist, so he was an interesting character. But he said, this is the most important chapter in the history of our province. And we happened to have also living in our community the archivist, who was about 85 years old. And when he said that at table, the archivist said, well, actually, the chapter in 1832 was much more important than this one is going to be. And he said, but then he said, if you start to think about it, the chapter in 1265, and he starts to go through a whole history, and at the end, this guy felt beaten down, and he said, okay, I understand, this is not the most important. But the perspective was 800 years of English province history, and it's like, you think this is going to be the most important? No, it's not. I'm sorry. So that was, I kind of preach on that once in a while. You get that perspective. It's like, oh, I guess this is the big crisis that we think it is. It might be a little crisis, but it's not life and death. So that was great. Yes?
Yeah, you alluded to it a couple times throughout the talk, but I'm curious about the influence of kind of the Gendelian reforms in the American Dominicans.
Yeah.
It seems like recently there's more of an interest in larger communities and going back to colleges more than parishes. And so I'd be curious kind of how those reforms have played out in our history.
Yeah, I would say it was very short-lived in the 19th century. They stopped it as soon as they could, or worked around it. And I think it's a luxury to have that, and that's why I think there's a little more interest in it now, because we have more numbers. And so it's like, yeah, this is, we can have a little more observance in a house and some regular, but I think it really, they looked on it in the States as this is a luxury. This guy's in dreamland, and so he doesn't understand the practicalities of the immigrant world, of the anti-Catholicism that we were going through, all that stuff. So they didn't have much patience for Jandel. I do have one, let me think, Kelly actually went to a general chapter, and please, let's see. I got these from his diary. He goes to Italy, and he says that the Italians, yes. Today the master, this is in 1862, today the master was elected general on the first ballot. Out of 48 votes, he had 37. The Pope has decreed that our generals hereafter shall hold their office for 12 years. The Italians did not want Father Jandel, but had not the courage to vote against him. Not using the opportunity when they could, they deserve to have a ruler, and they have one. There is an unfortunate division between the Italians and the French, which will in all probability continue. A species of electioneering has been going on here in Rome, of which even an American politician might be proud. Okay? And then he receives, I said today, this is 1859, I received 2 letters from the Most Reverend V. Jandel, our general in Rome. They do not explain difficulties I proposed. It seems difficult to get a plain and straightforward answer from Rome on any subject. A little of our young America, go ahead, do it, there's unclear what word he uses there, practicality, would do these Romans no harm. If you ask them whether white be black or vice versa, they will take a month to study over the matter before giving an answer, and at last the answer so carefully as to leave as much in the dark as ever. So he doesn't have a big opinion of going to Rome for any kind of solution to any problems. Let's solve them here and leave Rome out of this. So anyway, it's kind of fun to read. Very good, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And thank you for your hospitality, too. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, John. We have liturgy up in the chapel in 26 minutes. Thomas and Michael Monteri will be the celebrants. And John, I want to just, as a memoir of your time among us, our our own Dave Moore designed this poster. And there you have it. Thank you very much. You're welcome. See you all upstairs.